Frida Kahlo was discovered by the surrealist author Andre Breton, and she was kind of appropriated by the surrealists. Um, in 1938 exhibit at the Julian Levy Gallery in New York, Breton referred to Kahlo's works and Kahlo herself as a ribbon wrapped around a bomb. But Kahlo resisted this label. Remember, the Surrealists is a movement that's heavily indebted to Freud and psychoanalytic thought that sought a revolution of the unconscious and wanted to kind of create these irrational dreamscapes. But Kahlo didn't like that. She wanted to focus on her own lived experiences. And so, as a retort, she said, "I don't paint dreams, I paint my own reality." And we see in her work a focus on self-portraiture. The Two Fridas work that we see here is one of the most famous examples. This work was done after her first divorce from Diego Rivera, where we see a female figure that really stands out. She's not sexualized or eroticized the way that we've seen in so much of the work of the avant-garde. Instead, we see two Fridas side by side, one in more kind of typical Victorian European dress on the left, and the other wearing more traditional Mexican indigenous attire. These two are joined holding hands and connected here by these blood vessels. This refers to indigenous Mesoamerican rituals of bloodletting, but it also shows us this kind of doubling of Kahlo's identity. She has indigenous, Jewish, Hungarian, Spanish heritage. And so she often felt like she had this kind of split identity. We see that the kind of, this thinking about her recent divorce here, we see that the indigenous Frida is shown holding this tiny portrait, which actually is an image of Rivera as a young boy. And so we see a lot of autobiographical references here that really stresses the complexity of her own identity and doesn't reduce the female figure to a mere sex object. As we shift to art after World War II, we're going to shift more and more to North America, and particularly New York becomes the nexus of the art world. There is profound loss as a result of World War II. Over 30 million people were killed in the war, in the Holocaust, purges in the Soviet Union, and over 60 million people were displaced, 60 million refugees trying to find new homes. In Latin America, the struggle shifts after the World War to a struggle against European colonialism and imperialism. And I want to focus on that in the work of Wilfredo Lam, and this is his Rumblings of the Earth. Lam is a Cuban artist of Chinese, African, European, and indigenous American descent who was influenced by both Cubism and Surrealism in his extensive travels. He met Picasso. I feel like who didn't meet Picasso, I think, at this time? He also met Breton and other leading figures of Surrealism. And then he returns to Cuba in 1942, where he begins to construct a body of work using this kind of surrealist language, but also very much inspired by Afro-Cuban and Haitian mythologies and deities. we can kind of compare his work, I think, in a way, to the work of the Harlem Renaissance, trying to find, using the vocabulary of European modernism and the avant-garde, but to speak to another, to an experience of a person of color, to a different kind of lived experience. So this painting, I think, in a way, is almost like Lam's alternative to Guernica. He transforms Picasso's political statement by replacing the central victim of Guernica, that horse that is right in the center of Picasso's composition, with a specter, a ghost, that bears a large knife. And this is described by Lam as the instrument of integrity. Rumblings of the Earth is an aggressive painting. It includes vaginal and phallic references, animal motifs as well, that focuses the work thematically on the cycle of birth and death while suggesting ritual initiation and violence. For Lam, this sort of violence was a means of liberation, finally coming out from the yoke of European colonialism. In a way, it's in Lam's work that the victim in Picasso's canvas has now become the aggressor. Our final ism, hard to believe, is abstract expressionism. So the U.S. recovers faster from World War II in comparison to Asia and Europe. The fighting did not take place here. And so many leading avant-garde artists sought refuge in New York during or immediately after the war. People like Piet Mondrian, Max Ernst, Salvador Dali, Walter Gropius, and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe from the Bauhaus. And so abstract expressionism is an American modernist movement that's heavily indebted to these European emigres. It's a very loose group, and we can kind of divide these artists into two different categories: the action painters and the color field painters. Action painters are people like Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning. Lee Krasner, though she doesn't really fit into this limiting category for reasons I'll get into later. In color field painting, we talk about people like Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, and Helen Frankenthaler. I love sharing this early work of Jackson Pollock because it's so different than the canvases we're much more familiar with. But remember that he got his start in regionalism. His teacher was Thomas Hart Benton, and so we see these kind of swirling rhythmic forms in these paintings that really depict kind of this Americana, kind of Western subject. However, Pollock turns to the unconscious. Like Ernst and the Surrealists, he wants to tap into his unconscious, and he actually undergoes psychoanalytic therapy from 1939 to 1941. And he produces spontaneous artworks as part of his therapy. He was interested in a follower of Freud named Jung, Jung, a psychologist who was more interested in searching for universal symbols and what he called archetypes, these kind of timeless symbols, things that we constantly see throughout history, and images that persist in the collective unconscious of humanity. The wolf is one of those archetypes, according to Jung. And so we see this she-wolf canvas here, this image of a wolf worked and reworked multiple times, thick layers of pigment, that's almost kind of like an avant-garde cave painting. This work was purchased by MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, in the same year, and it rocketed Pollock's career. He begins to And I think this is where that label action painting makes a lot of sense, right? He begins to work on canvas, unstretched canvas, rolled out onto the floor of his studio, which was just a big empty barn. And he pours the paint, drips the paint, flings it with sticks. He mixes it with sand and gravel and all sorts of other, pieces of trash and detritus. He wants to get away from a kind of conscious art making process, but wants to paint directly from his unconscious, unmediated. This kind of lack of intimate control of the artist with the brush. And this is an example of one of these action paintings that's a result of this process. In Pollock's work, he rarely gave his works titles. He wanted the images to stand on their own merits, and Autumn Rhythm is actually a title that the painting received later. In a way, we can compare this to the surrealists who practiced automatic drawing. Again, this kind of ritualistic way of creating art directly from the unconscious. And there's a kind of rhythmic quality, this kind of energy, I think, in both Pollock and Andre Masson's work. Lee Krasner is a seminal figure in the history of abstract expressionism, but her work often goes unnoticed because she was the wife of Jackson Pollock. In fact, it's difficult to sort out who actually developed abstract expressionism. Abstract expressionists promoted a very macho culture, and there was a real regression in opportunities for women after World War II. GIs came home from the war, and women were encouraged to go back to the kitchen and take care of the kids. And so while Pollock was celebrated as the kind of James Dean rebel of the art world, Lee Krasner fought to get any sort of public opportunities to display her work. In fact, she displayed her work as LK to hide her gender. And we see in her abstract expressionism, it's much tighter, more intricate. She was interested in insular manuscripts. Think about things like the Book of Kells. She was interested in Persian textiles as well. And I think that really comes through in her untitled work here. Willem de Kooning also exhibits this very, kind of machismo of post-war American culture and abstract expressionism. This is very violent rendering of a woman. Her body appears lacerated and fragmented. It's a really kind of almost a kind of attack of the canvas here. And this graffiti-like application of pigment. On the other side, we have, that's in stark contrast, I think, to de Kooning, is a color field painter like Helen Frankenthaler, who makes the fluidity of the paint. So not the motion of the painter that we see in Jackson Pollock, who's kind of dancing around the canvas, but she's interested in creating the fluidity of the paint itself. And we see this watery flow of the pigment across the canvas, punctuated with controlled bursts of color and large areas of exposed canvas that is really a very different approach to abstract expressionism. All right, I'm going to end it here. And this concludes chapter 32.